Sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the one that brings the whole desert to your door. The town of Dry Creek sat under a pale orange sunset, quiet the way frontier towns often were when the wind slowed and the dust settled along the wooden street. A few horses stood tied outside the saloon. The smell of leather and hay drifted through the air. Most people in Dry Creek minded their own business, especially when trouble appeared. And that evening, trouble stood right in the middle of the street. Samuel Whitaker was an old rancher, nearly 70 years old, with gray hair beneath a weathered hat, and the slow, steady movements of a man who had spent 40 years riding open land. His ranch sat 2 miles outside town, a small patch of dry grass and stubborn cattle that survived mostly because Samuel refused to give up on them. Folks in Dry Creek rarely spoke about him, not because he was a bad man, because he was the kind of man people forgot. A widower, no children, just a quiet rancher who bought flour once a month and nodded politely to anyone who bothered to look his way. But that evening, every eye in town was watching him. For men from the livery stable stood nearby, voices loud enough for the whole street to hear. They spoke with the kind of confidence that comes when a crowd is watching. And the crowd was watching. Samuel stood calmly, leaning slightly on the hitching rail beside the general store, his face tired but steady. Dust clung to his boots after a long ride in from the ranch. Behind the stable wall, hidden in the narrow shadow between two buildings, a young Apache girl watched everything with wide, frightened eyes. Her name was Naya. Only hours earlier, Samuel had found her collapsed beside the creek 2 miles outside town, exhausted from running across miles of desert. She had barely spoken a word, only whispering that she needed water. Samuel Whitaker had done what he always did when someone needed help. He offered water first. Questions later. A canteen, a piece of bread, a blanket in the shade of his barn. That simple kindness had followed him into Dry Creek. Now the men in front of him were shaking their heads like they were teaching the old rancher a lesson the town believed he needed to learn. People whispered from the boardwalk. No one stepped forward. No one interrupted. Because on the frontier, silence was often the easiest choice. Samuel slowly turned his head toward the stable where he knew the girl was hiding. Their eyes met for only a second. In that moment, he spoke softly enough that only she could hear. "Run." Naya hesitated, fear and confusion in her face, but Samuel gave the smallest nod. She slipped away into the growing dusk and disappeared beyond the back alley toward the open desert. The men in the street never noticed. What Dry Creek did not know was that the girl they had chased away was not just any Apache child wandering through the territory. She was the daughter of a tribal chief whose people rode the desert farther east beyond the Red Cliffs. And by the time the first light of morning touched the wooden rooftops of Dry Creek, riders would already be crossing the valley floor. First 5 horses, then 20, then more than 200 silent figures moving across the desert toward the town that had chosen to punish an old rancher for offering a thirsty girl a drink of water. Samuel Whitaker had not always been a forgotten man. 40 years earlier, people in Dry Creek used to tip their hats when he rode into town. Back then, his shoulders were straight, his horse moved faster, and his ranch had more than a few thin cattle grazing across the open pasture. But the frontier has a quiet way of changing men. Drought years came and went. Markets rose and fell. And somewhere along the way, Samuel Whitaker simply became part of the landscape, like the windmill turning slowly behind his barn or the fence posts leaning into the prairie wind. His ranch sat 2 miles west of Dry Creek, where the dirt road curved past a shallow creek that only carried water after a good rain. The house was small, built from sun-faded boards and patched many times with whatever lumber Samuel could find. A single lantern usually burned on the porch after sunset, not because Samuel expected visitors, but because old habits stayed with a man long after the world stopped knocking on his door. Most evenings followed the same quiet rhythm. Samuel would ride the fence line, check the cattle, and watch the sun sink behind the low red hills. Sometimes he would sit on the porch with a tin cup of coffee and listen to the coyotes calling across the open land. The desert had a voice if a man was patient enough to hear it, and Samuel Whitaker had become very patient. That was why the moment beside the creek earlier that afternoon had felt so strange. He had been riding home from the south pasture when his horse slowed near the water. The animal lowered its head and snorted softly, the way horses do when they sense something unusual. Samuel followed the horse's gaze and saw a small shape near the bank where the creek bent around a cluster of mesquite trees. At first he thought it was just a bundle of cloth caught in the brush. Then the bundle moved. The girl was lying half in the shade, her breathing shallow, dust covering the hem of her dress. Her hair was tangled from travel, and her bare feet showed the long miles she had crossed on foot. Samuel dismounted slowly, careful not to startle her. He had spent enough years on the frontier to recognize exhaustion when he saw it. When her eyes opened, she looked at him with the cautious fear of someone who had learned that strangers could bring danger. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled the dry grass along the creek bank, and a hawk circled high above the valley. Finally, the girl whispered one word: "Water." Samuel unscrewed the cap of his canteen and handed it to her without asking anything else. She drank carefully at first, then with the desperate relief of someone who had been walking beneath the desert sun for far too long. Afterward, he gave her a piece of bread from his saddlebag and waited while she gathered her strength. Only then did she speak again. "My name is Naya." Samuel nodded once and rested his hands on the saddle horn. "Well, Naya," he said gently, "the desert can be a hard place to travel alone." The girl looked east toward the distant red cliffs where the Apache lands stretched beyond the horizon. For a moment, she seemed unsure how much to say. Then she lowered her eyes and spoke quietly. "They were chasing me." Samuel did not ask who they were. On the frontier, there were many kinds of men who chased others across the open land. Instead, he simply gestured toward the road leading to his ranch. "You can rest in my barn until the sun goes down," he said. "After that, you decide where you need to go." Naya studied his face carefully, as if measuring the truth of his words. Finally, she nodded. They rode the short distance back to the ranch in silence, the evening wind carrying the warm scent of sage across the fields. Neither of them realized that two riders on the distant road had already seen the small figure on Samuel Whitaker's horse and were guiding their mounts quietly toward Dry Creek. The barn behind Samuel Whitaker's house had always been a quiet place. Old wooden beams held up a roof that had survived many desert summers, and the scent of hay mixed with the slow creak of leather saddles hanging on the wall. As the sun lowered across the prairie, long shadows stretched across the dirt floor, and the warm orange light slipped through the cracks between the boards. Naya sat on an overturned feed crate near the stall door, wrapped in the blanket Samuel had given her. For the first time in many miles, her breathing had slowed, and the tight fear in her eyes had softened into cautious relief. Samuel moved slowly around the barn, tending to small evening chores the same way he had done every day for years. He filled a bucket with water for his horse, brushed dust from the saddle, and checked the latch on the side gate where the wind sometimes pushed it loose. The routine gave the place a sense of calm, the kind of quiet that comes when a man knows every board and every hinge of the building around him. Naya watched him carefully. She had spent enough time on the frontier to know that kindness was not something offered freely by every stranger. Yet Samuel Whitaker carried himself with the calm patience of someone who had nothing to prove and no reason to rush. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice still careful. "Why did you help me?" Samuel rested one hand on the wooden rail of the stall and considered the question as if it were something simple. "Because you were thirsty," he answered. "Out here, that is reason enough." Naya studied his face as though searching for some hidden meaning, but she only found the quiet certainty of an old rancher who had long ago decided how he would treat people. The evening wind drifted through the barn door, carrying the smell of dry grass from the fields. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called across the open land, For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Naya slowly reached beneath the collar of her dress and pulled out a small leather bracelet tied with a narrow strip of red cloth. The bracelet was worn from years of use, but the beadwork across the surface showed careful craftsmanship and patterns that meant something to the people who made it. Samuel noticed the detail immediately. Frontier men learned to read small signs the way others read books. That bracelet, he said quietly, was not made for trading posts. Naya shook her head. It belonged to my mother. She gave it to me before I left the camp. Samuel did not ask why she had left or who had been chasing her across the desert. Instead, he walked to the open barn door and looked toward the wide valley stretching west toward Dry Creek. The town sat just beyond a low ridge about 2 miles away, its rooftops barely visible against the fading light. From this distance, it looked peaceful, the way small towns often do when the day is ending and the lanterns begin to glow along the street. Samuel leaned against the door frame and spoke without turning around. "You can stay here until the night cools the ground," he said. "After that, you should travel east. The red cliffs will guide you home if you follow the stars." Naya nodded slowly, grateful but still uneasy. She had learned that safety on the frontier rarely lasted long. Outside the barn, the sky had begun turning deep blue as the sun dropped behind the western hills. The first evening star appeared above the desert horizon. Neither Samuel nor Naya noticed the faint cloud of dust rising far down the road toward Dry Creek, where 2 riders had already reached town and begun telling a story that would soon travel from the saloon to every porch and storefront along the main street. The lantern on Samuel Whitaker's porch flickered to life just as the last color faded from the western sky. Night came quickly across the open prairie, the kind of quiet desert night where the wind softened and the land seemed to hold its breath. Inside the barn, the air had cooled enough that the horses shifted calmly in their stalls, their slow movements echoing through the wooden beams. Naya sat near the doorway wrapped in the same blanket, watching the dark fields beyond the ranch as the stars began to appear one by one across the wide Texas sky. Samuel stepped outside for a moment and rested both hands on the porch railing. From there, he could see nearly half a mile across the prairie before the land dipped toward the road leading into Dry Creek. Normally, that road carried only the occasional wagon or rider after sunset, but tonight something felt different in the stillness of the air. Samuel had spent too many years on the frontier to ignore that feeling. A rancher learned to read the land the same way sailors read the ocean. Sometimes the quiet itself carried a warning. He listened for a moment longer and then slowly walked back toward the barn. Naya noticed the change in his expression immediately. "Is something wrong?" she asked softly. Samuel shook his head once, though his eyes drifted toward the dark road again. "Probably nothing," he said calmly. "Small towns have a way of talking when the sun goes down." And Dry Creek had heard a story tonight. Inside the saloon, 2 riders had arrived just before sunset and tied their horses to the rail outside. Their boots were still dusty from the trail when they stepped through the swinging doors and ordered drinks. They spoke casually at first, the way men do when they want a room to start listening without realizing it. Then one of them mentioned seeing an old rancher riding toward his property with a young Apache girl sitting behind his saddle. The words drifted through the room like dry grass catching fire. Conversation slowed. Chairs creaked as men turned their heads. On the frontier, stories moved faster than wagons. By the time the riders finished their drinks, the same story had reached the barber shop porch, the blacksmith shed, and the wooden benches outside the general store. Some people dismissed it with a shrug. Others did not. A few men began to speak about what it meant for someone in Dry Creek to shelter a stranger from the Apache lands. Back at the ranch, Samuel finished placing a fresh bucket of water near the stall and handed Naya a second piece of bread. "You should eat while you can," he told her gently. "Traveling under the stars takes more strength than people expect." Naya accepted the bread but did not take a bite right away. Her eyes had shifted toward the open barn door where the darkness of the prairie stretched far beyond the fence line. "My people will be worried," she said quietly. Samuel nodded. "Families usually are. That is why you should head east before midnight. The stars will show you the way." For a moment the girl remained silent. Then she slowly stood and walked toward the barn entrance, looking out across the dim fields where the road disappeared into the distance. The night wind lifted strands of her hair as she listened to the quiet land. Far away, almost too faint to hear, a distant horse snorted somewhere along the road leading out of Dry Creek. Neither Samuel nor Naya could yet see the figures moving through the darkness beyond the ridge, but the desert had already begun carrying footsteps that would reach the ranch before the night was over. The night had settled fully across Samuel Whitaker's ranch, and the prairie stretched under a sky filled with quiet stars. The lantern on the porch cast a soft circle of light across the wooden steps, while beyond that glow the land disappeared into dark fields and low drifting wind. Inside the barn the horses shifted calmly, their slow breathing mixing with the dry scent of hay. Naya stood near the doorway watching the horizon as Samuel checked the last latch along the fence line. Out on the frontier, a man learned to prepare for the night the same way every evening, because routine was the only promise the land ever kept. Samuel returned to the barn and leaned lightly against the wooden post beside the entrance. The old rancher looked out across the road again, the same road that curved away toward Dry Creek 2 miles to the east. From here the town could not be seen, but its presence was always there in the distance like a small island of lantern light beyond the hills. Tonight that road did not feel empty. Naya sensed it too. Her shoulders stiffened slightly as she listened to the wind moving through the dry grass. "Someone is coming," she whispered. Samuel remained calm, though he had already heard the same thing. It was not loud, just the faint rhythm of horses moving slowly across hard dirt somewhere beyond the ridge. He turned toward her with the same quiet patience he had carried all evening. "You should leave now," he said gently. "Follow the creek east for half a mile. After that the stars will guide you the rest of the way." Naya hesitated. The bracelet around her wrist caught the lantern light as she moved her hand. She did not want to bring trouble to the man who had offered her shelter. Yet she knew trouble was already close. Before she could answer, the distant shapes of riders began to appear along the road. At first, there were only 2 figures moving through the darkness, their horses stepping carefully as they approached the ranch gate. The lantern glow from the porch reached them just enough to reveal familiar outlines. Men from Dry Creek. They slowed their horses near the fence and looked toward the barn where Samuel and the girl stood in the dim light. One of the riders tilted his hat back slightly and spoke with the casual tone of someone who already believed he understood the situation. "Evening, Whitaker. We heard an interesting story back in town." Samuel stepped forward just enough that the lantern light touched the brim of his hat. "Evening," he replied calmly. The second rider glanced past him and noticed the small figure standing inside the barn doorway. His eyes narrowed with curiosity rather than anger, but the message had already been carried from town to ranch and back again. Word travels fast across a place like Dry Creek, sometimes faster than the truth itself. Samuel understood that better than most. He turned slightly toward Naya and spoke softly without looking at her. "The road behind the barn leads straight to the creek," he said. "Go now while the night is still quiet." The girl did not argue this time. She slipped into the shadow behind the stable wall and disappeared into the dark fields beyond the lantern light. Neither rider noticed the moment she vanished. Their attention remained fixed on the old rancher standing alone beside the barn door. The wind lifted dust along the road as more faint shapes appeared farther back along the ridge. The 2 riders exchanged a glance before one of them spoke again. "Looks like we might not be the only visitors tonight, Whitaker." Samuel followed their gaze toward the distant horizon where several more horses were beginning to crest the hill beneath the starlit sky. The riders along the road slowed their horses as the night wind moved quietly across the prairie. The lantern on Samuel Whitaker's porch cast a warm circle of light that barely reached the fence line, leaving most of the land in shadow. From the barn doorway, Samuel watched the distant ridge carefully. The first two men from Dry Creek remained near the gate, their horses shifting beneath them as they also studied the horizon. More shapes were appearing now along the ridge. Not many yet, but enough to turn the quiet prairie into something watchful. One of the riders near the gate let out a low whistle. "That is more company than I expected tonight," he said quietly. Samuel did not answer immediately. He rested one hand on the barn door frame and looked across the fields where the faint silhouettes of horses moved slowly against the starlit sky. After a moment, he spoke in the same calm voice he had used all evening. "Travelers sometimes ride late when the desert cools down." The rider gave a small laugh. "Travelers do not ride in a line like that." By now 5 figures had come over the ridge. Their horses moved steadily but without hurry, crossing the valley floor in silence. The men from Dry Creek shifted in their saddles, suddenly unsure of what kind of story they had followed out here. Behind the barn, Naya moved quickly across the dark pasture, following the narrow path Samuel had described earlier. The creek lay about half a mile east, winding quietly through the grass before turning toward the distant red cliffs. She moved carefully, staying low whenever the wind carried sound across the open land. After several minutes, she stopped near the edge of the shallow creek and turned back toward the ranch. From this distance, the lantern on Samuel's porch looked like a single small star resting on the ground. She could see the faint outlines of riders near the gate, but her attention moved beyond them toward the ridge where more figures were now appearing. The night sky had grown brighter with stars, making the valley easier to see. 10 riders now, then 15. They continued moving forward in calm silence, spreading across the land like a slow line of shadows crossing the prairie. Back at the ranch, the 2 men from Dry Creek had grown noticeably quieter. One of them leaned forward slightly in his saddle, squinting toward the approaching figures. "That is not a small traveling group," he said under his breath. Samuel finally stepped away from the barn and walked a few feet closer to the gate. The lantern light caught the silver strands in his hair as he looked toward the riders. He had lived long enough on the frontier to recognize the discipline of people who knew the land better than roads or towns. These riders were not lost. They were not wandering. They were moving with purpose. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint sound of many horses crossing dry ground. The rider nearest the gate swallowed and spoke again, this time without humor. "Whitaker, did that girl you helped mention where she came from?" Samuel kept his eyes on the horizon. "She said her name was Naya." The man nodded slowly, as if that answer explained more than Samuel realized. The line of riders continued growing across the valley floor. 20 now. Then more shapes forming behind them along the ridge. No shouting, no rushing, just the steady rhythm of horses moving across the desert night toward a small ranch where a single lantern still burned beside the door. The desert valley had grown strangely still as the riders continued crossing the open land beneath the stars. The lantern beside Samuel Whitaker's porch flickered in the quiet wind, casting a small circle of gold against the dark boards of the ranch house. Beyond that soft glow, the prairie stretched wide and silent, but the distant rhythm of horses had begun to fill the night air. The 2 men from Dry Creek sat motionless on their saddles near the gate, their earlier confidence fading with every new shadow that appeared along the ridge. At first there had been only 5 riders, then 10. Now the line had stretched wider across the valley floor, more figures emerging slowly from the darkness like a moving horizon. The men counted without speaking. 20 riders, then 30. Their horses moved calmly, stepping over dry grass and low stones without breaking formation. No torches burned among them. No voices carried through the night. Only the quiet sound of many hooves pressing into desert soil. Samuel stood beside the barn door, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he watched the approach. Years on the frontier had taught him that silence sometimes spoke louder than noise. These riders were not rushing toward a fight. They were riding with the patience of people who knew exactly where they were going. The man closest to the gate finally shifted in his saddle and cleared his throat. "Whitaker," he said quietly, "that looks like more than a traveling party." Samuel nodded once without taking his eyes from the valley. "It does." The second rider leaned forward slightly, squinting across the dark land. The starlight revealed more shapes forming along the ridge. 50 now. Then more appearing behind them as the long line continued moving down the slope toward the ranch. The man exhaled slowly. "That girl you helped," he began before stopping himself. Samuel finished the thought calmly. "She told me her name was Naya." The riders exchanged another glance. Neither man needed to say what they were beginning to realize. Stories traveled quickly through Dry Creek, but some truths traveled faster across the desert. Half a mile away beside the creek, Naya had stopped once more. From the shallow bank, she could now see the entire valley stretching toward the ranch. The lantern near Samuel's porch still burned steadily, and beyond it the long line of riders had begun spreading across the land like a dark river flowing through the grass. She counted the figures with quiet certainty. 40, then 60. Her heart slowed as recognition replaced fear. These were not strangers searching the desert. These were her people. At the front of the approaching line rode a tall figure whose horse moved with the calm authority of an experienced leader. The man wore a long feather tied behind his shoulder, and his posture remained perfectly still as the riders behind him followed his pace. The Apache chief had crossed many miles of desert that night, guided by a story carried across the land by wind and hoofbeats. A story about a young girl who had reached safety and spoken the name of the man who had offered her water when the desert nearly claimed her strength. Back at the ranch, the two men from Dry Creek were no longer whispering. They simply watched the valley in silence as the riders drew closer and closer. The number had grown far beyond anything they expected when they first followed a rumor out of town. Nearly 100 horses now moved across the prairie floor, their shapes clear beneath the starlit sky. The rider nearest the gate finally spoke again, his voice barely louder than the wind across the grass. "Whitaker, that is not a group." Samuel Whitaker gave a slow nod as the line of riders continued expanding across the valley. "No," he said quietly, "that is a tribe." The valley floor had become a sea of quiet movement beneath the stars. Horses continued crossing the prairie in long, steady lines, their silhouettes stretching farther than the men at Samuel Whitaker's gate could count. What began as a handful of riders had grown into something far larger, a silent gathering that now filled the open land between the ridge and the ranch house. The lantern on Samuel's porch flickered as the night wind shifted, but the old rancher did not move. He stood beside the barn with the same calm patience he had carried through every season of his life on the frontier. The two men from Dry Creek remained near the gate, no longer speaking. The sight before them had taken the confidence from their voices. The line of riders slowed as it reached the lower valley, spreading across the prairie in a wide arc. More than 100 horses now stood beneath the starlight, their riders forming a quiet presence that made the land itself seem to listen. At the front of the gathering, the tall figure of the Apache chief guided his horse forward with slow, deliberate steps. His posture remained straight, his gaze steady as he approached the small ranch where a single lantern burned beside the door. Behind him, the riders came to a gradual stop, their horses settling calmly, as if they had traveled this desert road many times before. No one raised a voice. No one hurried forward. The entire valley rested in a silence that carried weight and purpose. Samuel Whitaker stepped a few feet closer to the fence, his boots pressing softly into the dry dirt as he waited. He had lived long enough on this land to recognize the meaning of such quiet. This was not the arrival of strangers searching for trouble. This was the arrival of people answering a story. Nearly half a mile away by the creek, Naya watched the moment unfold. The sight of her people spread across the prairie filled her chest with relief and certainty. She stepped out from the shadows and began walking slowly toward the ranch again, following the narrow path along the creek bank. The Apache chief guided his horse through the final stretch of open ground until he reached the fence near Samuel Whitaker's gate. The two men from Dry Creek instinctively eased their horses back a few steps, giving the approaching leader space. The chief stopped his horse and looked calmly across the fence toward the old rancher standing beside the barn. The two men studied each other in the lantern light for several quiet seconds. The chief's voice, when it finally came, carried the calm authority of someone who had spent a lifetime guiding others across the desert. "We followed the wind tonight," he said slowly. "It carried the story of a man who gave water to a child of our people." Samuel nodded once. "The desert can be a hard place to travel thirsty," he replied. The chief studied him carefully, then lowered his gaze slightly in a gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed by the riders behind him. At that moment, Naya stepped from the dark path beside the creek and walked toward the lantern light of the ranch. Several riders turned their heads as they saw her approach. The girl stopped beside the fence and looked up at the chief. "I told them what you did," she said softly to Samuel. The old rancher gave the smallest shrug. Anyone would have done the same. The chief shook his head slowly. Not everyone would. Behind him, the long line of Apache riders waited in complete silence as the wind moved across the prairie grass. The chief then turned his eyes toward the two men from Dry Creek who still sat near the gate. His voice remained calm, but the question he asked carried across the entire valley. "Which men in your town believe that kindness was a crime?" The question hung in the night air like a stone dropped into still water. The two men from Dry Creek felt the weight of it immediately. Behind the Apache chief stretched a silent line of riders that filled the valley beneath the stars, their horses standing calmly as the desert wind moved through the grass. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the quiet shifting of leather saddles and the distant whisper of wind across the prairie. Samuel Whitaker remained beside the fence, his weathered hat shadowing his eyes as he watched the moment unfold. The lantern beside the porch flickered softly, casting a warm glow across the ground between the ranch and the riders. The man nearest the gate swallowed slowly before answering. His voice no longer carried the easy confidence he had shown earlier in the night. "Some folks in town thought it was wrong to help someone from the Apache lands," he admitted carefully. The chief listened without changing expression. Beside him, Naya stood quietly, the small leather bracelet around her wrist catching the lantern light. The chief lowered his gaze toward her for a moment and then looked back toward the riders waiting behind him. He raised one hand slightly. The gesture was simple, but the response was immediate. The long line of riders shifted forward together, not rushing, not threatening, simply moving closer until the front of the gathering reached the edge of Samuel Whitaker's fence line. More than 200 figures now filled the valley floor beneath the open sky. The two men from Dry Creek felt their horses grow restless beneath them as the weight of the moment settled across the land. The chief spoke again, his voice steady and clear. "Among our people," he said, "when a man offers water to a child in the desert, he becomes part of that child's protection. The desert remembers kindness, even when towns forget it." Samuel tilted his head slightly, but said nothing. He had never been a man who needed praise for doing what felt right. The chief studied him again, then turned his horse slowly toward the valley. The riders behind him waited for his signal. Naya stepped closer to Samuel and looked up at him with quiet gratitude. "I told them the truth," she said softly. Samuel gave a small nod. Truth usually finds its way across the land sooner or later. The chief raised his hand once more. This time the signal was clear. The riders turned their horses one by one and began moving back across the prairie in the same calm formation in which they had arrived. No anger, no celebration, Only the steady rhythm of hooves returning toward the distant red cliffs where the Apache lands stretched beyond the horizon. Within minutes, the valley began to empty again, the line of riders fading into the darkness beneath the stars. The two men from Dry Creek watched in stunned silence as the last figures disappeared beyond the ridge. The night returned to its earlier quiet, leaving only the lantern glow beside Samuel Whitaker's porch and the soft rustle of wind through dry grass. Finally, one of the riders near the gate cleared his throat. "Whitaker," he said slowly, "I think the whole town is going to hear about tonight." Samuel rested his hands on the fence rail and looked out across the empty valley where the riders had been. The desert was quiet again, as if nothing unusual had ever happened there at all. "Maybe they should," he replied calmly, "because out here a man does not become important by how loudly he speaks or how strong he stands. Sometimes the only thing the desert remembers is the moment someone chose to do the right thing when no one else did."